So Leo, I need to screen share and then, yeah, so we'll go screen share. Is this going to work for you? To be able to do it from within Zoom. So then in here, we'll go to play.
So that's or you're sharing this screen. You're sharing my next image.
No, this is that.
Yeah, but I think this is the screen that you're sharing.
Oh, you're seeing both, you're saying?
I would say stop share.
Okay.
And we share the other one.
All right, so you'll have to exit out of here. Maybe while you're doing that, I'll start intro.
I don't know what I'm doing. Show navigator.
Never mind. I'll stay with you. I like your shoes better.
Thank you. Wait. Here. So Zoom, share screen, and I have to share. It's not Keynote, desktop, that one.
Desktop 2?
Desktop 2, yes. Share. And the other thing that I have to exit is I'm trying to get back to here. I don't know where the mouse is.
Just try to hit play and see if it'll do it.
Yeah, but I don't find the mouse.
Oh, I got it.
I don't know.
Oh, shit. Wait.
So the mouse, there it is. It's coming back. Here, play. Boom.
Got it. Okay, perfect.
Okay, we're going to get started. First, say thanks to everybody for coming, and I'm going to have the really boring part, which is to do the introduction. We were joking outside with Rocky about stories when Martín was here in 2008. Rocky started to tell a story to Mark. Martín was like, wait, I'm going to tell it in the talk. So I'm just going to give a very formal introduction. Probably odd that I'm giving an introduction. Claudio could certainly be the person to give the introduction. Mark, you could do it. But I'm just going to read this and then turn it over to Martín. So Martín Huberman is an architect and director of Estudio Normal in Buenos Aires, an architecture and research office where he develops experimental and speculative projects on the built environment. His works and projects have been exhibited in different cultural venues around the world. In 2011, he founded Mano Ambiente, the first nonprofit gallery in South America specialized in experimental architecture and design. The gallery has built and installed exhibitions from some of the most renowned offices of Ibero-America and produced exhibitions along with other institutions such as the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, Liga, Espacio de Arquitectura in Mexico City, and the Canadian Center for Art and Architecture. Sorry, the Canadian Center for Architecture. Since 2015, Martín has directed a preservation and development program for the archive of deceased architect Amancio Williams, experimenting with new forms of digitization and dissemination of this culturally important architectural archive. And if any of you don't know who Amancio Williams was, you have to take a class with Claudio. And since 2018, Martín has curated exhibitions and research projects for different institutions and museums, such as the Canadian Center for Architecture, where he actually is curator of the CCA CARA Buenos Aires program from 2020 through 2023. Here at ASU, Martín will begin to talk about his non-traditional career path from his professional education to today. And with that, please help me welcome Martín.
Well, thank you all for being here. Should I have to speak to the microphone? Thank you, Phil, for making this happen. And thank you, Rocky, for lunch. I'm going to start by showing some of the earlier work that brought me here. This is a studio that we were doing in Buenos Aires when Claudio Beckstein brought some of ASU students to work in BA, and then after that some Argentinian students will come to ASU to fulfill the work. I was the only one to come, and the program died after me. So that might be a good thing or a bad thing. The day I came to ASU, this was the ASU introductional package. I remember having a discussion with the sheriff, speaking about alcohol in school, and my most vivid memory was that the school therapist suggested that at one point we might have, or us foreign students might have a culture shock. And all of that, what they gave us for the culture shock was that small bouncy ball and a number to call. So you can guess what happened 1.5 months later, culture shock. So there I realized that some of the work that I've been, or some of the origins of the trip wasn't actually experimenting desert life, but most of all doing studio work. Because of some kind of logistics, I lost the train of ASU students that came back to Arizona. So I came back on my own, not knowing anyone, and I end up falling into the realm of the applied collaborative research studio that Darren Petrucci and Phil and used to do here at school. So last time I was here, not just I used a man bun, but on my presentation, someone screamed at me that I spoke like Borat. I don't think that might have changed, but also I wanted to say that that wasn't very nice. So I ended up spending a lot of time with these three guys. This, for me, it's a very important talk because this is where I learned most of the principles that I try to apply in my office for 15 years already. So here I learned how to serve food for professors, how to row in a team in a river that it's inexistent, how to have group therapy. And I even, some of us ended up sleeping together in the same space. But most of all, what I learned was to research. And that's one of the key pieces of my office for these many years. The project we researched upon was the class of the future, the classroom of the future. There was a huge problem of classroom availability in the western area of the US. The population growth of schools was surpassing the ability of schools to enhance new classrooms. So they ended up adding trailers to the schools. We figured out that those trailers were supposed to be in the school for maybe only the summer or a year, but they ended up staying for 15 years. So we developed a project based upon research on how to create a classroom that would fit new ways of learning through the ages, through 15 years. That classroom was shaped into an hexagon that actually applied logistics on modern education, on modern heating, and modern construction. We ended surpassing the needs of the studio that was only to design a classroom, and we ended up designing whole schools, or a method to build schools in the western area of the US. And not just we designed the classrooms, but we started designing the environments around the classrooms. This was called an air tree, which was a secluded patio that ended up working as a climate regulator, but also as a safe space to have fun while living in the desert. As soon as I came back to Buenos Aires, I decided to open my own office, like fulfilling a childhood's dream of not working anymore with my parents. And I hired these two guys. Those are the first employees of Normal. Look at what we done with Rocky. The studio started trying to bring in some of the programs that I learned here at ASU. Obviously, with zero resources, one of the first ideas was to retake some of the experimentation that I had gone through the studio of Claudio Beckstein. These are cloth pegs, wooden cloth pegs that we use at Claudio's studio and that I had in my patio. And this is the actual photo that shows the start of the office, the opening moment of the office. I like to create, to think of it of like a garage band office where we started at the terrace of my house, building structures that we couldn't draw, but we could build. This is a double curvative surface, a paraboloid hyperbolic paraboloid that I still cannot draw, but I know how to build it. Even though that at first the details weren't very good, we ended up selling this first piece that we called Tender. And we started understanding that maybe through this material research, we could start creating our own language. So that piece got sold at a gallery. And with that money, we decided to outgrow it and create a new piece. And that language started to become into phrasing and paragraphs. Then we added color and we started to exhibit in non-conventional spaces. This was a fashion store in Buenos Aires. But these images, thanks for the beauty of the internet, ended up arriving to London, and we were we were hired by a London agency to work on large-scale species for an opening store in London. So this is very quickly, this is actually 2 years after leaving ASU that we were already traveling with our work. That was very, very fun. Then we started to work on new logics on how to create this language and how to take it not just to large-scale installations, but smaller, allowing people to work their own micro installations. And through that, this was an object requested by a local museum to be sold on their store. For us, it was the entry gate to museums. In Buenos Aires, there are no exhibition spaces for architecture. So we had to enter traditional exhibition spaces such as galleries, museums through the windows. We were very lucky to have a lot of requests from abroad. This is in Paris. This is Madrid. And this is the office of Juan Herreros, Estudio Herreros back in the day. And we connected through, he knew our work and he asked that if we could do something for his office. And this is when the system that up to that point was only like a suspended system become a vertical system, like kind of a wall. It allowed us to discover the possibilities about creating a new wall system or a new division. We showed that to the gallery in Paris, and they asked for us to prepare products for them that were exhibited in Le Grand Magasin de Paris. And as we were doing products, we realized that through the same logics, we could create this vortex. That's how we call the first lamps that we were doing. And through lamps, we decided to go bigger, obviously. So a friend of ours had this beautiful house and he wanted an installation made by us. So we found this ring in the trash, literally, and we managed to fulfill it with 5,000 cloth pegs. This is an idea of scale. But that's the moment where we realized that we were not building objects anymore, but spaces. So we started to push that agenda forward. And it took us a couple of years, but this is our biggest installation so far. It's 70,000 cloth pegs at the Museo Mar in Mar del Plata, near Buenos Aires. This is somehow of a, I think it's 45 feet tall structure. it had a mirror on the top of it, so it break the space, the void of the museum, and we lay down a small structure below, a small mattress, a small bed for people to lay down and reflect themselves into space. We are still trying to get the full storm, not just the vortex, but we are trying to get these strategies. Yeah. From that moment on, we understood that there was something in materials, like a secret hidden within itself. This is what in the studio we call industrial archaeology. We look for materials that already have something within. So this is Rocky and Vernon, rather former ASU student, also going through the hardware store, looking on things that we could use to create strategies. These are laundry baskets that we took up on the streets. We wanted to create a structure that allowed us to fight against cars in the street. Then we took it to a big hill that coronates part of the city of Buenos Aires. And I tried to use it as a medium of transport, which obviously didn't work. This is an experimentation that we did on triangulation with clothes hangers, plastic clothes hangers in the university in Colombia. And I managed to convince all the students that they were doing a summer program in Barcelona to take like 100 clothes hangers each to Barcelona, and I flew there. So we took it to the streets and we canceled parts of the city through this kind of weird fencing. These are plastic benches, hexagonal plastic benches that ended up turning into a concert scenario for one of the Buenos Aires like electronic music bands. And then we continue like going into industries, knocking industries' doors, convincing them to let us in, trying to get them into new projects, which we couldn't, but we ended up having a lot of good results by just taking things that they already have. This is styrofoam. This is how styrofoam is made. The styrofoams are inside the wood, how do you call these walls? Like composite walls? Yeah, those composite walls. Well, these are like 5 meters bricks. Each one of they weigh 70 kilos, which I think is something like 150 pounds. This was a structure all made by hand by us. It was a VIP for a major art show in Buenos Aires. But the problem up to here was that none of these objects had a story within it. We gave their new narratives, but they didn't come with a narrative up until the moment that we got to the colonial tile. The colonial tile, this was a piece that we did for the 200-year revolution, the bicentennial of the revolution of the Mayo, which is the moment where Argentina left the Spanish crown and became a republic on its own. The thing is that after 200 years, we are still using an object that refers to the colony. So that object had a story on itself. So by representing the object through a revolution, a formal revolution, we were speaking about the history, about the material, at the same time that we created the mythology of being on a roof, sitting on a roof, on a warm roof in the summer. So we started creating spaces for venues, for musical venues and stuff. But that's where we realized that we wanted to work with historical research. We wanted to go beyond the material itself and start going deeper into the books. That's where I kind of copied Claudio Bexen's love for this iconic architect, Argentinian architect called Amancio Williams. And what I was very fond of this project called Una bóveda cáscara, it's not just, it's also una paraboloide hiperbólico, but it's a project that Amancio Williams has been working for 15 years until it's finally made its completion. during 15 years, what's funny about the project is like he has been depicting his idea from a street level perspective. For 15 years, he has tried to put this typology into houses, supermarkets, industry, pavilions, memorial pavilions. But the only picture he takes when he finally builds it, it's on top of it. Discovering that somehow maybe the top part of the paraguas, it's popularly known as paraguas, was maybe even better than the lower part. So with that stupid hypothesis, I started to work on a research on how to rebuild that project. So the first thing that we did was, as I do not want to work with historical archives because it gives me a lot of anxiety to be so close to history and to maybe spill something out of a blueprint. We asked them if we could digitize all the blueprints of the Paraguas project, of the Bóvedas Casca. So we started a collaboration with the Archivo Williams, which is an archive held by the sons of Amancio Williams. He had nine sons and daughters, and they all were after it. It allowed us to understand better the structures and the ways of Amancio's thinking. So for example, he ended up building a monolithic structure, but when you see the blueprints, the original blueprints, you see that he was thinking of a duolithical structure. So the paraguas on a piece on itself that you can see here, and then the column that goes all the way down, it's another piece. Also, we discovered the genius behind the structure. As you saw that the surface is a very complex surface, and it's only designed to only nine curves. So by designing 9 curves, he managed to do a very complex surface. He also tried to do it in bricks, in metal and other strategies. That's what we discovered by digging. But what we were most interested in is before he managed to build the big one, he did a small one to corroborate some of his ideas. So we went after that. Obviously, doing a small concrete structure like that was an expensive job. And also, back in the day, nobody cared about Amancio Williams, and less they would care about an Amancio Williams research-based project. So we ended up creating a strategy to narrate our process through reconstruction. So we built a small object for people to be able to give to his friends or architect friends and tell the story about the studio that wants to rebuild some of the Amancio Williams structures. At the same time, that allowed us to corroborate some of the narrative, some of the myths behind the structures. On one side, there's the traditional structure. You have the blueprints, the formal, and on the other side, you have the myths, the stories that the sons of Amancio Williams are telling. So at one point, they were telling us that these structures were referred to the 9 meters by 9 meters paraguas. Amancio Williams actually designed 3 paraguas on 3 different sizes. So we were very eager to be very precise on that, but we depended on a story told by his younger son. That's where we found out that not just the myth was wrong, and we found out the harsh way, understanding that either way I have a very, very big head, or the 9 meter structure was not the original one, but the 13 by 13. So we continue trying to force this into some kind of a popular culture of Buenos Aires scene, with the realm of trying to build this piece. The 9 by 9, for you to understand, it's the same size of a traditional Buenos Aires 2-bedroom apartment, which is 81 square meters. I know that you won't understand this, but I won't be able to speak it in speed, so I'm sorry. Our whole idea was to not just to experiment, but through experimentation and through different logics of narrative, trying to make people understand the powers of scale and the powers of size. So we were trying to, by these 1 to 10, 100, 1 to 10 little sculptures, we were trying to recreate the same size of the Williams original paraguas. So we hit a break after years and years of telling this story. Once we entered through the window, we discovered through research and through looking at formal strategies on the architecture that nobody looks at, like formwork. This is how most of buildings, small like concrete buildings, are made in Buenos Aires. There's this formality on formwork that is not designed by architects, but designed by craftsmen, like woodworkers, that are actually the ones that create formal interpretations of a concrete slab, and they create these very vivid spaces. Amancio was different, obviously, and he had a formwork blueprint. There you can see Claudio sitting and looking at the formwork of the paraguas. And through these images of Claudio's research, we understood that there was a beauty on the formwork as well as a beauty on the final work for Amancio, and that's what we tried to represent. We figured out that we couldn't do the 1:1 scale, but we could do a 1:2 scale for an art show in Buenos Aires, and we presented it as a sitting space, as a common area for people to gather. Like once you discover the whole show and you get a little bit tired, you can go to the paraguas and rest. Also, for us, there was like a side story. We were bringing back the paraguas to the original site where they were built. So we started falling in love about all these images and this imagery that it's within the project itself, but it never goes out. Like we have been very eager to all these kinds of images while we are designing, but these are not final renderings. These are not final shots. These are not the images of a project that appear on a magazine or on a blog. So we started to figure out that as parts of the project, the same thing as with formwork. And as this was a place to sit, we wanted to make it very comfy. So we made it in wool, a carpeted wool formwork. People really liked it. They left their kids there until they grew. But actually, this was a huge surprise, and this is where the myth or our hypothesis that space actually was an interesting space. The image that Amancio was trying to give us, like, stand here, come on in, and inviting was actually true. We had the chance to do a second installment on that, and obviously after the formwork, we wanted to work on the reinforcement steel. There were a lot of blueprints on reinforcement steel, and thanks again to the research of Claudio Bechstein, we found that these blueprints hand-drawn blueprints made by the structural engineer of the paraguas that Claudio built in the year 2000 in the coast of the Rio de la Plata. I fell in love, obviously, with these colors of the gradient and the idea of color being a communicational tool, not just a representation of a will or a project, but to understand that color actually wants to say something. So we decided to go for it and build the structure itself. Again, we brought to the museum a craftsman and his son. So we saw how the learning process was live. Again, this is not an academic strategy. This is a father to son, mom and pop, like going down on generations and generations. There are pieces of the structure that were not designed by us, but made by the craftsman itself, like the wiring in between the different wires. And at one point, what we were creating was actually a strategy that allowed you to understand one of the first and most fundamental pieces of architecture, language, which is the relationship in between the built environment and gravity. So what you are seeing right here is the colored rivers, the actual forces of gravity of the weight of the piece itself being worked through the rivers in the museum. At this point, we were sharing space with Amancio Williams himself, who was depicted in the boards in the back. That led us to a complete design strategy, not just for museums, but for clients themselves. So we had this idea on why don't we design a concrete structure that is never going to be built, but we trick the formwork woodmaker to think that it will. So he would create the formwork for that structure, and the formwork would be the final project. So it's like cutting the process in between. We call this project the ghost limb because concrete has this language of the formwork on itself. Every time you see concrete, like out of the blue, you will see some traces of the handcraft of it, that it's lost in space. That office didn't end up being built, but we used that project to pitch an idea for a Swiss museum that was asking us to work on the studiolo, working on one of the most ancient typologies in architecture, which is the Cabinet de Curiosites or the Il Grotto, which are these secluded spaces where notaries or rich people used to get secluded with all their most darkest wishes and collections. This is like what in America would be called a man cave. Back in the day in Florence, this was what a man cave used to look like. So again, we designed the formwork 1:2 scale of the Palazzo de Uffizi, the Palazzo Uffizi. We sent it to Bern, and then we had the most amazing formwork from a Swiss woodworker built this structure, which we did not design at all. Like, this is not part of our piece, that's their work. So we only designed a very simple structure and they did all the work. We understood that contrasting Swiss handwork and Argentinian handwork would be an interesting stuff. So we asked an architectural photographer to represent formworks in different construction sites from friends of ours in Buenos Aires. And we exhibited that as well to make people understand the differences in between construction logics. We are not a precise construction community, but we handle. Once I understood the capacities and the possibilities of architecture, not just as a project-based, but as a research-based discipline, I started a journey into the curatorial. All my life, I've been much of a designer than an academic. But I understood that at one point, if I didn't do something to create an environment where architecture would exhibit and think differently than just project or for residential or for commercial uses, I would never work in BA. So I decided to open a small shop called Monoambiente, which is the single unit, the livable single unit, smallest livable single unit available in the market. It's the same unit that is sold commercially and has been part of the real estate bubble in Buenos Aires. It's the same size as the traditional structure, livable structure that it's available in villas, in slums. The only thing that commercial real estate sells it for one family, and in villas might even hold like up to 3 families. So we figured out that through experimental invitations to different offices, we will be able to make the cake grow. And as we already had a piece of that cake, our piece would grow. But at the same time, a community was being formed. We thought that the difficult part would be to create a market for the gallery. We found out very quickly that there was no market and that we had to go non-profit. Also, we understood that there was no culture within the design offices to perform these kinds of work. So everybody that got invited thought that we were an art gallery, so they wanted to represent their art. And up until Monambiente, the way to represent architecture was always through representations of architecture, such as models, plans, pictures, but never the architecture itself. So what we focused on was every project had to be a site-specific project for the gallery, and it would have to be represented on itself. It's not a representation of something that is not there. It's what's in there that it's interesting. We ended up collaborating with some of the most interesting galleries around the continent, maybe one of the most interesting exhibitions that we did was along with the Canadian Center for Architecture, that were depicting a show called The Other Architect, talking about creating a collection of offices that do not work strictly as a projective office, but more of research-based offices. We invited designers, fashion designers, industrial designers, architects that became cooks, architects that became artists. And one day we decided to close because we were repeating ourselves after 20 exhibitions. During that period of time, we found out that the sons of Amancio Williams were looking for an institution to donate their work, their father's work, the archive, which, as you might imagine, is a terrible thing for a culture, like a cultural discipline, to lose one of its most renowned architects' archives, and losing the possibility to be close to that work and to perform the works that similar to the works that we did. So, since we had a very good relationship with them, we asked them if we could create a program of digitalization program that went from that moment on up to the moment where the archive was gone. By that, we also presented the problem about an archive about to leave the country 5 years before it actually happened. We built a team on researchers and developers. And since we were a very, very small institution and we cannot hold an archive, we don't have the budget to create the refrigeration for an archive. We don't want to also harness all the problems about reconstruction of the blueprints. We decided to go digital. And this is a very interesting, this is when we presented the beta for the website. That in the same space that you can exhibit one piece, one original piece, we could exhibit like almost all of the projects. What the website that it's still on, and you can go and have a look at it, presented as a possibility also was to crisscross some of the Amancio Williams project. So you can, through tagging, you can go and see all of Amancio Williams' hand-drawn drawings. Obviously, we didn't upload everything because it's impossible, but we went from this, which was a representation of Amancio's last book, also co-curated by Claudio, to this. a myriad of projects. We worked on this for 5 years up until the moment where the family decided to donate the archive. So our last curatorial piece on the Archivo Amancio Williams was a goodbye event where all of the people that worked with him or worked with the archive or knew the archive of Amancio Williams wrote a letter to Amancio himself. I might say that one of the most iconic moments for me was listening to a Kenneth Frampton letter where he was asking his forgiveness to Amancio Williams for not including him at his famous book about contemporary architecture of the 20th century. Once that happened, I started working for institutions, larger institutions, creating exhibitions, and again, trying to depict new ways of looking at architecture and design. This was called Towards an Agenda, obviously rephrasing Le Corbusier's famous book, Towards an Architecture, where what we were trying to do is understand the discipline of architecture and design, not just as, again, object producer disciplines, but research-based or thoughtful strategies. We have, as professionals, we have the amazing possibility to foresee something that's not there yet. We can project upon it, we can design upon it, but most of it we can show, we can exhibit, we can communicate through it, renderings, drawings, photographs. So we started working on laws. We worked on 3 different laws that were happening in Buenos Aires in that time. The new law that changed that monoambiente, that single studio, from a large structure to a very minimal structure, which is depicted in this picture. By creating this small space, all of these objects will have to go. Another one of the pieces by Fernando Shapochnik, it's representation of the architecture's byproduct. These are containers you typically use in architecture to throw all the demolition pieces or all the things that are produced by a construction site. When one of these appear in your block, all the neighbors start throwing their trash to it. It's like a amazing void that nobody takes care about, so they throw everything. So Fernando's series of pictures, it's very representative of that. So we started, in this moment, we started to think that architecture beyond itself, like what we design actually creates a second architecture that we are not in control of. This is a series of Javier Agustín Rojas that depicts the facades that the law creates. So a law in Buenos Aires, the old building code of Buenos Aires created all these patios, these very weird structures that suddenly are created by a law. And since we have an economy that goes from prices to prices, some of the areas in Buenos Aires are not fulfilled, so you end up having these side facades that are not part of the thing. And what's interesting is that owners of these apartments start to open up holes, illegal holes, into the median walls to create new visions. The second big large-scale exhibition was based on the idea of regaining the narrative of the future. So I took the logics of Archigram, which but when they started, they were in school, a bunch of crazy guys that managed to, through a fanzine, to perform an idea of a future that still it's important for today. So we are still revisiting Archigram, and this is like you guys starting a project here at ASU, and that project ends up being part of a major cultural event in the history of architecture, of modern architecture. So we understood that the city was maybe the best strategy to plan some of the some ideas of the future. So I selected 10 offices, and I gave each office one particular scenario or urban scenario to work on. My most beloved one was the lunar one, the moon, the city of the moon. This is a beach city, and in Buenos Aires, there's a big tradition of tents, like subletting tents inside the beach. So Monoblock, which was the studio behind this project, understood that at some point the city would transform the beach landscape into a more of an urban landscape. And then part of the idea of this project was to regain the narrative of our own future. As we are a third world country, we usually end up acquiring futures that are designed elsewhere. We use phones that are designed in California. We ended up following the steps of astronauts that arrived to the moon, or even look at the moon in a very technocratic way. So I was wondering what would happen if we start to think ourselves about these same logics. This is where I received this beautiful presentation by Diego Arraigada, which is I think it's the best Argentinian architect of the present. He was working on La Ciudad Lunar, the moon city. And what Diego said, that moon is mostly a landscape. Still, it's most of it is a landscape, and will remain a landscape. And most of it would remain a landscape for the 99.99999% of the population that is still going to see the moon as a landscape. So his idea for the city was, in one part, a sustainable idea on how to create space using craters as already existing spaces, and how to hover the space of the crater through una cúpula. But the most interesting spot was that you wouldn't realize that there was a city there just by looking at it. Yet the cupola created a different shadow from the crater, the opposite shadow. So what you would create, it's actually a shadow, an opposite shadow. So this is where I understood that the collaborative in architecture is fundamental. So these are all the offices involved in this exhibition. This is a think tank that happened for months, and this is the way I like to work now, like really opening up to different ideas and trying to push different agendas. The last curatorial piece that I'm going to show, it's the last installment that we did for the Canadian Center for Architecture for the Buenos Aires program. It's called You Met Me at a Very Strange Time in My Life, obviously inspired by this moment of Fight Club. This moment is actually when Tyler Durden achieves its goal of demolishing all the credit banks. And so all the banks collapse, and they create this idea of a ground zero for financial debt and kind of a revolution of the freedom of debt. In Buenos Aires, something like that happened 20 years ago. In 2001, there was one of the biggest crises. It was, for us, as big as the 2008 for you, maybe even worse. All the banks shut the possibility for people to go and get their savings out of the bank. So there was all the trust on banks collapsed. So people that had money didn't want to take the money to the bank anymore. So architecture appeared as the perfect scenario to invest, to put your money into bricks, the safest scenario. It's part of a tradition, like an European tradition of buying land, that it's very common in Buenos Aires, but also it was part of a moment that created this particular set. For you to understand, this is not an article. This is a guy buying an apartment. In Buenos Aires, you buy an apartment, you might buy a TV in 50 installments. you can pay the TV for 4 years. But a house or an apartment, you have to pay it in cash, all in once. You have to somehow have that cash, take it with you on a backpack. This is real. I did it. On a backpack, fearing that you will be robbed from all of your savings, put it on a table, spend 3 hours counting it, and then buying a house. So when that happened, architecture has been building an aesthetic of trust. Architecture has been building all the banks, all the central area of Buenos Aires is filled with banks. All the major stations, all the major banks have their headquarters there, and it has been built during 70 years. So they did all the traditional things. They brought marble from Italy. They brought the best architects from around the world to create this idea that the banks are a formal institution up until 2001, where they didn't let people get in. So you have this very typical Molotov bearing anarchist, as you can see, a Bolshevik, or this one. It's so tragic that it's funny. At that point, the architect became an institutional safeguard. And this is a very, very weird moment in history. I was in school and all of my friends started doing buildings by gathering not just the money saved by their friends and family, but finding the lot and also doing the construction. So architects that were educated as projective architects became developers from the night to day. So the money that used to be saved in banks deposit safes ended up being saved in buildings. And that at first created a very interesting set of typologies in architecture, because young architects were having the possibility to produce their own work. But at the same time, markets started to gain interest into these strategies. So the typology started to be worse. The buildings started to be worse. And now you can count a few very good buildings, like Adamo Faiden buildings or Estudio IR buildings or Ana Smooth buildings. The market, the whole of the market, it's just buildings are thought as a way of depositing money, giving an interest rate of up to 20% over 2 or 3 years, which is a lot. So the series of Manuel Nesta that were depicting some of the stories behind our research for the CCA try to create this idea. This is Clorindo Testa's famous Banco de Londres, rethought as a strategy for monoambiente, as a building for monoambientes, or as we called it, a pigeon cage. The last project I'm going to show is the one that got me here. This is a project about a chair. Again, at the same time that I was doing the Amancio Williams project, I found out the story about this chair. Maybe you know this chair as the butterfly chair, but actually it's called the BKF chair. It's designed by 2 Argentinians and 1 Catalan. It's BKF comes from the last names of it's an acronym of their last names. It's called Bonet, Kurchan, and Ferrari Ardoy. Do we have audio?
En el invierno de 1940 se realizó en Buenos Aires una muestra de interiorismo en la que los arquitectos Bonet, Kurchan y Ferrari Ardoy, BKF, presentaron su sillón en hierro esmaltado y cuero. Apenas un año más tarde, el BKF es incorporado por el Museo de Arte Moderno de Nueva York a su colección permanente. Primero fue la editora Artec Pascoe y luego la firma Knoll que comercializaron el sillón a cambio de girar los royalties correspondientes a sus creadores. Pero el trámite de patente americana iniciado en julio de 1940 no se concretó, y así la difusión del sillón fue exponencial, pero a través de copias sin autorización. Fue entonces la industria de la copia que integró al BKF a la cultura popular, sellando su trágico final como modelo firmado y privando a sus autores de todo tipo de reconocimiento internacional. Con el tiempo, las copias adquirieron nombres tales como africano, continuo, ardoy, argentino, pampeano, latino y el más popular entre todos, el sillón butterfly. Al borrar las siglas de sus autores, fue que se borró también el verdadero origen del sillón y los trazos que lo hicieron único.
So, after being bought for its permanent collection by MoMA, the chair became a very popular chair, and mainly in the western side of the US. It played along very beautifully with the mid-century modern aesthetic, and I think what I believe is like it covered a specific gap that where there was nothing alike on the collection for the local designers such as the Eames, the Nelsons, and it gave the outdoor spaces, the kidney pools, the perfect companion for a leisure style way of sitting. So we started finding that Richard Neutra was very fond of the BKF chair. We find it with photos of Julius Schulman on Neutra houses. My favorite, Craig Elwood, also was very fond of the BKF chair. Even Frank Lloyd Wright. The myth says that the second chair that came after the MoMA one went straight for the Falling Water House. And this is actually a project that we found here in Arizona. I don't know the architect, but maybe you will. So for us, once the chair is copied, it's no longer a chair. The chair was copied so many times that it loses its shape. So you cannot grant that the seating will be the same. So it became a building material for us. We doubled it to create a lamp. That was the first idea. And then we realized that by fulfilling the full arc, we could create maybe spaces like a catwalk space for a fashion show. If we close it, we will create a ring that will enable to create a new space within it. And with the ring, we wanted to create a tower as our peers were doing back in the day. And from the tower, we understood that maybe we would have to go back into a smaller pergola style structure. The interesting process is that we learned by doing. This is actually the first drawings that we did at the studio. You remember that studio, Roque? So when we did the first process, we thought that the ring wouldn't close, but it closed when we built it. Once we built the first prototype, we convinced a major designer to do a fashion show, and we went very quickly from having 12 chairs to 60. Then we started prototyping for projects one-to-one. We started playing with textiles again to fulfill the completion of the byproducts of the chair, structure and textile. We created structures that were as big as our studio. And we learned from it. Again, we were creating a language. This is when we actually presented the tower for a competition that we didn't win, but we insisted into building it. And somebody heard and made that one of the neighborhoods in Buenos Aires finance. They didn't buy it. They financed the completion of the tower. This is the day that we gave all the pieces to build the tower, and they asked us to put them on a lot, on an empty lot near a river. This is how we found it 3 years later. So we understood that that ruin was actually very interesting. Like plants really like the chair, and we could create it like an endless recipient. So that was one of the strategies that we tried to fulfill with this pergola. This is in my house. Now, this is the newest design that we produce. We are trying to get slimmer columns because it's, as you can see here, the columns are very present on the design and we don't like that. So we managed to get the columns, a composite column made of the same diameter of the whole chair, of the diameter of the chair. This is what we are trying to do right now. Finally, I'm going to present the project that we are actually exhibiting at Coachella. It's called the Cocoon. Again, trying to reclaim the narrative that knows the chair in the US, the chair is known as a butterfly. So we play with the irony of where does all these butterflies come from. So we created a huge cocoon made of butterfly chairs. These are the first installments for the conversation. We ended up using the lower one, which is the 300 chair structure. It's this one. We decided to do the fabric in Lycra because we wanted to play with this idea of a cocoon being all white during the day. Very minimal. We liked seeing, I really enjoyed seeing how the shadows in the desert were actually a good strategy. And while we were having this conversation with the Coachella art department, the lighting guy, who's a professional, he lights up all the stages, all the scenarios for the Coachella festival. He said, if you leave the chairs white and the structure all white, I will make it pop during the festival at night. So this is the first image I saw when I got on Thursday, last Thursday to the festival. This is not a rendering. Cocoon changes within time during the night, creating different environments, working as a beacon for people to gather or just to trip. It's super trippy. And this one, once after 2 days of looking at what they have built, I decided to go in and ask them to play a little bit with the lighting. So I created this all white. This is really the most bright piece at Coachella at one point. It only happens 5 times each night. So 30 times total in its life. This is a Jamie XX concert actually going on. I'm on the crowd of the concert. At one point, the concert, all the major screens go red as part of his performance. So that's what I call the Mars moment. So it's the structure put in Mars. What I like is like it's so bright that actually the shadows project in all the other structures around it. So I make all the structures a little bit of mine. That's a very Argentinian thing to do. And now there's the aftermath of all this. I'm trying to convince Coachella to not tear it down, but just to move it somewhere else and to create a spatial cocoon, a possibility of native vines to grow on it up until the moment to make it disappear. So cocoons will grow and butterflies will actually find a place to live within the desert. And while I was preparing this presentation, I realized that this maybe has been a 15-year-old idea in the making. Gracias.
Anyone have any questions for Martín? Yeah, okay, we got a handful over here.
Firstly, that was a great presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, like, the students who are interested in working on projects or installations, how do you suggest we expand our exposure towards projects that we or firms that do such
There are a bunch. It's like finding your way into it. I remember the first installation that I saw was a LA-based studio called Balls and Nogs, or Nogues actually, who Gaston Nogues is an Argentinian, and they work for materials and application. They did a very beautiful piece for materials and applications. I think this is a speculative architecture now. It's growing very, very, very big due to festivals or biennials like the Chicago Biennial and all these spaces that are actually opening up to new performance on architecture, or architecture as a way of thinking or as a way of expressing difficulties. There are a lot of institutions that work on these very particular scenarios. I would suggest you to look at what the Canadian Center for Architecture is doing, which is groundbreaking. Every exhibition is like really, really something. The work of Giovanna Borassi, their director, it's amazing. Mirko Sardini, his previous director. Spain has gone into speculative architecture because of the crisis in 2008. They all went into studying and not producing, not projecting, but studying, and that led into a catalog of architects working into these realms. Still, it's a very off-grid strategy. There is no like major scenarios, but I would say like start looking, start reading, and figure out what suits you best. Yeah, I will definitely. And but most of it, start doing. I think that's the key. Like do not wait to get invited to anywhere. Like actually the piece that we did with Rocky was pushed into strategically pushed into a hallway because we understood that hallways were not exhibition spaces. So it was a gallery that depicted photographs, so they needed distance to see the photographs. So at one point we said, this is a space that nobody will want to. So we with that structure, we created for the gallery an exhibition space. So after us, a series of artists came, and that has been happening all the time. Like it's not because I'm claiming to be the first, but because our strategy is trying to get the spaces that nobody wants to be able to do stuff. That's a main strategy. I would start by learning by doing, and then obviously you can go into more complex discourses, scenarios by reading and looking at these other disciplines.
So I saw there's a lot of complexity in your design. My question is, what workflow do you use when you initially come up with a concept, and at the time you realize it in real life, what software do you use in between to do that?
What processes? Sorry,
what workflow do you use?
software. This was one of the, I think, one of the lessons that I followed more thoroughly learned by here at ASU, which was do the most stupid approach to every project. We don't, what you see, it looks very complex. It's not parametric. It's just 1 + 1 strategy. So we only grow by the cocoon structure only grows through addition of 2 chairs on the side. The complexity of the chair itself gives us a very complex strategy. As I'm not a parametric architect, and never has the studio had parametric architects working within. We try to force every project to be able to be designed into the traditional CAD, and maybe we go into a more complex scenario when we want to depict an idea, or we, for example, to understand the size of the fabrics for Cocoon, we have to go into industrial designers to allow us to fulfill the curves and then to open it up and be able to cut it along a shape. But we do CAD. Very simple, like we don't do, we have never done. At one point, we tried to ask Federico Negro. You remember he used to work, following your recommendation, he used to work at, what was it?
So he was a case.
He was a case, but before case, he was a shop, yeah. He was at shop and they were designing tools for shop, and then they opened up an office that actually did that for many offices. And we asked them a tool to design the tenders, the bellies, the paraboloid. And that piece, doing the tool costed us $7,000 on just building the software. And we, at that point, the most of what we have done by that would be $3,000. So it made no sense to create that. The 70,000 cloth spec structure, it's so simply thought that you actually do not need scaffolding to build it. You build it standing on the ground, and what you do is you take it up as you are building it. We discovered that actually the weight of the cloth specs that come from the top to the bottom opens up the net by itself, and the curve starts to be designed on itself. By opening up the net, it creates an open space to put the pegs by hand very, very quickly. So usually we try to be very, very stupid on all the design process. Like if the design process is complex, it might get very complex to build, and we don't want to perform that agenda. We want to. It's very difficult to convince someone to do a structure of 70,000 cloth specs. So at one point you have to be like, listen, this is very simple, and you show it to them. You know, you have to be able to show it to them. Actually, that was when we presented the first ideas for Cocoon. It looked very complex, and we have to show them with 2 chairs through a video call. Like, you add them like that. You can use zip ties to perform the first structure so you understand it. And yes, we try to, we here at we used to call it the Dum-Dum Strategy. Yeah.
Ordinary objects in the head,
it was trying to figure out how to build my own projects without major budget. Like the baskets actually comes from an obsession with Bucky's Fuller domes, yeah, geodesic domes. So it's an obsession about triangulation. So I love triangles, so I started triangulate. But in the basket, actually, what allowed us to perform that shape was that the basket was not a perfect cone, which would create a lot of complexities, but the cone tapered at one point, which allowed us to connect the lower parts into a triangular shape and not have a complexity on the rings. So yeah, mainly it's we try to play with those ordinary objects because of two principal strategies. One is that they already are part of the popular culture. So somebody gets amazed when they realize it's cloth specs. And they get amazed because they had a cloth spec on their hand and they know the feeling of it. That does not happen if you see like a Frank Gehry's aluminum facade. It amazes you because of the complexity, but it's not something personal. You know, you don't have that feeling. So at one point when we have, and that creates a connection, a very, very vivid connection. So that's the whole office agenda, is to create connections in between space and individuals, like experimental connection, like something more related to feelings that to concept. And the second strategy is that it's very difficult in Buenos Aires to build structures, like complex structures, to convince someone that has the machines to stop doing what they do every day and suddenly understanding that what they have, they can do something different. So this was a strategy to access the industry, you know, to access plastic injection, to access, we at one point we were consultants for the tile, the tile fabricators. So the colonial tile, they were having a huge issue because tiles were fading out the market against tin roof structures. So as they didn't have a design team, and this is like a major company that just bought a $3 million machine to do thousands of tiles per minute, like a huge company. They didn't have a design lab, but they had a lab. So the day that we were invited to the factory, we entered a material laboratory where they actually were able to do a ceramic tile that looked like a tin roof, because they thought that it was a shape thing, not a concept, not a complete concept. And at one point, they had extruded ceramic pieces like this big that they were testing for a stairs for a client or something like that. And we told them, like, that what you have there, it's actually a brise-soleil, you know, a sunshade structure that would work perfectly in the sun. You would definitely lead a market that does not exist there. We show them projects by Renzo Piano that he was already doing this. So, but at one point, their culture didn't allow them to jump into that. So it's a way to reach, breach, and try to create this more complex strategy of building new pieces. Okay.
The projects that have to do with activism or public space.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can talk about effectiveness and also how your notion of research has changed over time.
The research one is easier. Well, you were there. It started as material research, like just trying to build stuff, and suddenly that wasn't enough. So there's a historic research, and historic comes with an agenda on its own. So we try to focus on that and try to understand new logics on that. We are very much interested into the public because that's the realm where we think we could create major connections or major movements. I'm not trying to break the message like straight, you know. And in Coachella, I know that people won't understand the butterfly BKF chair consortium, so I don't care about it. But what we are trying to do is to create that from the minimal connection to the most complex connection. So we understand that's the way we get there. So by doing this 11-year research on the BKF chair, that's our thing. Then if that thing ends up getting new involved, like people involved, great. But with the Amancio Williams project, we learned the hard way that your activism is not enough, you know. Like it was the most, for me, it was devastating to end up losing that battle. I was the only one in my time. I think Claudio was before me, and there was many before me, but during my time, I was the only one trying really to push that agenda, taking it to the news. And when they actually donated it, I was the one to blame. Was super weird. So at one point I understood that no matter what you do into that activism strategy, you will always get a setback from it, because again, it's the same thing as with structures. I remember when we did the museum structure with a small cloth bag, there was a 300 cloth bag box that will allow you to do yourself. And I remember being there, like browsing what people said. And one guy said, these are like, they try to steal your money. They are charging you $100 for cloth bags. And if you did actually the number, and if you would go and buy 300 cloth bags at the supermarket, it would be even more expensive than the box that because we were buying by bulk. So at that moment, I understood that good and bad, you are creating the connection anyway. The guy is thinking about that, and in a media of stuff that is surrounding you all the time, to be able to create that moment, I think it's enough. So at one point, I learned that the hard way, that even though if you get bullied or booed at, you are taking them away from their traditional. So I think that activism has a lot to do with it, you know, like to really focus on how to create minimal changes that are not gonna maybe change things now. But for example, for the Moon City, that's the first Argentinian that has designed a moon city. And we created that for a museum, and that was foreseen in the museum. And in 50 years, maybe it would be recalled as the first structure ever thought by an Argentinian for the moon. An Argentinian on itself, not working for NASA or not working for any, like, so it's about those minimal pieces that I'm going after. What was one?
So you mentioned this school for architects, training developers and stuff, and this type of design, research design route has allowed you to freedom and artistic expression. Do you think it's possible to reintegrate that back into basically a traditional form of the architecture profession?
We've been trying to. Obviously, when you depend on a client, it's difficult, and a client trying to do its own house, it's very difficult to convince. We have managed to do more on the material experimentation. We have a couple of projects on the website where we created a weave structure that we discovered that the weave is it's on the market through rolls. So it creates the weave on itself, it's already like pre-rolled. So we created a structure that actually takes that shape, and we put it inside a house, which looks perfect. But that took us a lot of convincing, and we have been working now with developers. Obviously, they get brought in by these more fireworks that we produce. Once we are there, we are trying to push some different agendas and learning by doing. Again, we've been working with a developer that has done, I think, that over 30 buildings on the area where I live in. So he knows the code by hand. And what we are trying to do is use his knowledge to perform different types of buildings. So in one case, he discovered that the code allowed you to do 12 apartment, a building of 12 apartment buildings, but there was more square meterage. You could build more on the building than, more on the public than on the actual private part of the building. So you could build like 1,200 meter square apartments, which will do 1,200 meters. but you actually could go to even 2,000 meters. So what we designed was that the common spaces, instead of being hallways, we gave them width. You know, we created actual same outdoor rooms, and the neighbors were the ones deciding what to do with them. So it's trying to push non-traditional strategies to a traditional market. We pitched that idea to the actual client, who was the investor, who was the guy putting the money, and we pitched that idea on February 2020. So 2 months before pandemic, we were proposing that you would have your apartment, which would be 100 square meters, but you could share 800 square meters of common spaces with all your neighbors, like a three-story building of neighbors, and you would decide upon what to do with it through a collaborative agenda. That would make the investor have to build more building than the one that he could sell traditionally. And at the same time, I don't know what's going on. And at the same time, the cost of an apartment would go up. So when the investor, during the meeting, after seeing all the projects, said, I really like the project. So if I'm buying an apartment in the building next door, and I'm buying your apartment in your building, what's the entry ticket? How much would it cost me to put? So it was like a 20% more. And he said, I'm gonna lose all my clients by doing that. We tried to convince him that, okay, you pay 20% more, but you get 800% more of usable space than the traditional apartment that is gonna be next door. But he couldn't see it. When the pandemic burst and outdoor space was, like secluded outdoor space was the thing, I ran into him once again. And I asked him, what do you think about it now? I think it's a very good idea, still not interested. So it takes time. Well, you've seen, it takes 15 years to have the power to convince someone to bring you back to school. Yeah.
It actually looks pretty similar to the Lunar City, but they're disconnected though. They're not connected all together.
No, never. No, last time I was here, Rocky and Vernon went to the Rodent crater. They didn't call me. I think I was shooting ants.
They also weren't allowed to be in the stocking.
But no, I wanted to go to Arcosanti, and I know there's a lot of experimental architecture here in Arizona that back in the day I couldn't revisit beyond Taliesin. But no, thank you. I will definitely look into that. It must look, it's desert domes, so it must look like very moon-like, right?
Yeah, it was like a tech company built them and then they abandoned them. So it was like covered in cool graffiti and stuff.
And people do not live in it?
No, no one lives in there.
Okay.
They're like somewhere between moon domes and Mad Max.
Sounds like Argentina.
One more question.
Another question. So yeah, when you're just showing us the chair and the way you duplicated it and made it into a structure. So right now there's one design studio in our college that we are following the same procedure, taking the column and converting it into a building that has reminded me of the same studio.
Oh, very nice. It's called the Dum-Dum Studio.
It will be now. Sudden.
More physical interaction. We found that people's behavior isn't as what you expect it to be, how they interact with the space. Or you prototyping it so that we know what they're going to do.
Yeah, we try, and I try never to focus on they have to do what. I actually when we build it, I am the first one to start looking at new ways of approaching, like with the Cocoon, the image that I just showed you about coloring and stuff. I couldn't even believe it. So at one point, I tried not to showcase my perception of the things that we are doing into one particular scenario, but to open it up. Like on Sunday, when Coachella was closing, actually, we found a group of six sitting on the columns. For me, the columns of Cocoon are the worst. They're like really big. I usually do the joke like it's a structure, the monument to the column, because it's so thin, the structure, that you don't see. But these girls were sitting on the columns, like each one, like it was like a gathering, like a Gaelic gathering, something was going on there. So we approached, and they started saying that they didn't find a spot in the whole Coachella festival where they could be at ease. But suddenly, as they were six, they found the columns, and the columns felt like a place to set their back on, and to sit and to be calm, and to hear Billie Eilish from the far, and not be in the crowd. And she wrote today. She wrote to me on Instagram saying, "Listen, I didn't. We were so surprised that you were there. Like we had a very small discussion, and then we got kicked off." That she wrote to me like, "We were really not finding our spot in the whole festival." And I don't know if you've been to Coachella, but it's like Disney World for young adults. You know, and so you have all of these things designed to really attract your mind. You have Harry Styles singing with Shania Twain. So at one point, fighting against that and creating this small community of people sitting, you have to be very open to that happening. I learned that very early when I heard someone saying that what we did was complete crap. So I understood that you have to be open. And I don't lecture about the Cocoon and the chairs. I actually ask, what is this for you? What it represents? How do you see it? And then you start dialoguing. That's for me the most important part.
What's your next big project?
We are trying to in BA. The crazy thing is that I never built one of these big ones home, so I never shared with my friends and family, which is terrible. Like in Coachella, on my own. I have one friend with me, and that's it. So we are trying to do the storm, the closed back piece, like the whole storm. We're trying to do that. And now we are working on I've been following a structure which is a three-piece structure. We are, do you know, like wire planters, like these planters that allow you to put a planter is maceta. How do you call maceta? Is planter. With the plant, and they rise the structure from the floor a little bit. It's a small. That doesn't work anymore, no? No, don't worry. So we started to replicate that and create. We call it a domestic botanical garden. So we are planning on creating an exhibition structure made of traditional domestic planters, but we are willing to give the plants to different citizens of the city for them to guard them. And then we take them back to exhibit it 1 year later. So we want to create like, I know that you have a very beautiful botanical garden here in Phoenix. I would love to go there tomorrow, but we want to create this domesticatory tool, you know, bring in the domestic, like the plants that you have at home that you really take care, and you feel so bad that if they die, to bring that into urban structures. So we are trying to create like a 2,000 plant and structure for 2,000 people. So it's like creating a community of gardeners, like domestic gardeners, nothing very complicated. So you need to be able to have a plant living for 1 year. And after that year, we would ask that plant again and exhibit it in a public scenario, like a museum or something like that. So we are looking for the pride of, you know, look at this cactus. It really grew. So we are looking at that thing that when you go to someone's house and you see the corner with the plants very beautiful. Well, we want to take that into under highways or like non-domestic scenarios. We call it the domesticatorium. It's like a strategy to domesticate urban scenarios that have no use or no meaning, and to bring some of the home feel to those areas. That's what we are trying to push. Sorry? Yes. You get canceled.
For dinner, I want to talk about how it is that you still don't know how to draw the closed-in structures. But you found that Monty Williams can draw the parabolas.
Okay.
So that's all. Thank you, Martín. Thank you.
Thank you.